Welcome to the National Civil Rights Museum's podcast, Imagine an America. I am your co-host, Dr. Russ Wigginton, President of the National Civil Rights Museum, and I invite you on this journey. The topic today is Beyond Sports, from celebrity to legacy, and our guest is Dr. Aram Goudsouzian, a University of Memphis history professor who teaches on the civil rights movement, the modern United States, and the history of American sports. He is the editor of the Sports and Society series, published by the University of Illinois Press. Thank you for being with us, Aram. So given your background and your work and your experience to date, tell us about why sports and why athletes are so culturally important as we think about the United States.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say, to begin, thanks for having me on the show. And the Civil Rights Museum has always played a special role in my time here in Memphis. I've been here 20 years, and since I moved to Memphis, the Civil Rights Museum has been sort of central to my understanding of the city, to my teaching. I bring my classes here, and to my public-facing work as well. And for years, I lived across the street from the museum, so it was sort of a daily part of my life in that way. And it's special now to be on the board of the Civil Rights Museum and to be here with you. Now, to your question, sports, I think, has always been, to some degree, kind of an underappreciated aspect of understanding American society and culture. It looms so large in our lives, right? If you think about how the Super Bowl is almost like a national holiday, that our everyday conversations with strangers, friends, family often revolve around sports. If you think about right here in Memphis, about how the Grizzlies and the Tigers are such a cultural focal point for how we think about ourselves and how we define ourselves. From that, then, it's easy to understand maybe that sports can help shape our conversations about race, because race is so central to understanding the American experience. And the issue of civil rights has been one of the defining political issues in American history, dating back to the 18th century and certainly into the 21st. So from that perspective, if you think about just the cultural importance of sports and the political significance of race in American life, the two naturally merge.
Well, and to that point about the merger, it's led to some interesting conversations and situations over time. That merger has led to situations that are often lifted up about famous athletes like Muhammad Ali and Bill Russell and Althea Gibson and so many others. Can you speak a little bit about what happens when that merger, if you will, comes into play?
Sure. I think one thing that's really key to understand, thinking in terms of the larger African-American historical experience, is that sports has often played a role of outsized significance because historically, black people have been excluded from traditional channels of power, right? From economic leverage, from political power itself. So in the world of sport, like in the world of entertainment, right, that elevated African Americans and historically gave opportunities and visibility that didn't exist in other realms in American life, thinking back to the late 19th century and through the 20th century. And so, major significance was read into black cultural figures in sport. If you think about boxing, for instance, in the first half of the 20th century, the figure who galvanized a lot of anti-black opinion among many whites in the early 20th century was Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson won the heavyweight championship in 1908, beat Jess Willard in 1910 in a famous match on July 4th. There were fight films that were distributed around the country and then were ultimately suppressed so that black people wouldn't see a black man knocking out a white champion. And Jack Johnson kind of lived life on his own terms. He didn't subscribe to the dictates of what we might call respectability politics. He loved to go to saloons. He loved to gallivant around with women, including white women. We were breaking one of the key taboos. And so he, by the virtue of how he lived his life, plus having the status of heavyweight champion of the world, right, which at that time was the biggest crown in sports that you could imagine. Boxing was, along with baseball, the major American sport. Johnson defied a lot of those taboos and became a figure who was ultimately, by white America, often vilified to the point where he was prosecuted under something called the Mann Act, which was a morality law because he was bringing white women across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes. Contrast that to a figure like Joe Louis, who rises in the 1930s, another black heavyweight champion in America, who his handlers basically tell him to live life and present yourself in a way that's the antithesis of a Jack Johnson, right? To subscribe to those respectability politics, to make sure that you're never seen being photographed with white women or with bottles of liquor, to make sure that you never taunt your opponents, to be as sort of dignified and respectable as possible. And Jack Johnson goes on, of course, to win the heavyweight championship, to ultimately knock out Max Schmeling, who was a German boxer who was seen as representative of the Nazi regime in the 1930s. Louis is during World War II, tours through World War II bases and becomes a figure of sort of patriotic significance, and is a figure almost universally admired by, say, white sports writers and by the white public in a way that Jack Johnson was not. So if you pair these two figures together, Jack Johnson and Joe Louis, right, these two great heavyweight champions, you know, they kind of illustrate kind of the poles of black cultural meaning. But together, they can really illustrate a larger truth about the role of sports in American life.
Sure, and then you go on to someone, if we stick with boxing for just another second, we go on to someone like Muhammad Ali. And if you don't mind, say a little bit about his influence on the sport. And if you don't mind, speak to his arrival on the scene. And then, dare I say, the towards the end of his life. And what public opinion might have been about him.
Right. Yeah, the trajectory of Muhammad Ali's image has shifted over the course of the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century in really remarkable ways. When Ali arrived on the scene, of course, he was known as Cassius Clay in the early 1960s. He wins the gold medal in the Rome Olympics in 1960 when he's still an amateur. And at that point, first of all, boxing is seen as a sport on the decline. There hasn't been a great champion since Rocky Marciano retired in 1955. The sport is plagued by corruption. The organized crime is involved in the sport. Television has kind of weakened the product. The sort of the craft of boxing seems to be on the decline. And Ali almost single-handedly resuscitates boxing as a key phenomenon in American life in the 1960s. He's brash. He's outspoken. He's pretty. He's pretty, as he puts himself. He plays with gender, and he's an exceptionally handsome man. And at first, the white establishment kind of resents him simply because he doesn't subscribe to the way that an athlete is supposed to act. Right? He's not humble. He's not. He plays for the cameras. He's designed for television. Right? He's rising at the same time as television. He's so magnetic on screen. But then after he knocks out Sonny Liston in 1964 and becomes the heavyweight champion, and when he knocks out Sonny Liston, Liston was part of the sort of the symbol of boxing's decline. He was supposed to be like the bad man. He was a guy who'd spent time in prison and was associated with organized crime. He was seen as the bad guy for so long in sort of the boxing's larger narratives. But the sports writing establishment sides with Liston as opposed to who was then Cassius Clay.
It reminds you of a who would you rather have kind of moment.
Right. Well, the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
From the perspective of kind of the sports writing establishment. And when Ali knocks him out in Miami in '64, he points to the press row and he says, "Eat your words, right?" He knows that from the beginning, he knows that he's part of a larger narrative, right? He's an icon for the media age. So that's the first thing to establish with him. Second, of course, is his membership in the Nation of Islam, right, which is just surfacing right around the time he wins the heavyweight title. Within weeks of winning the title, he announces that he'd like to be known by Muhammad Ali, by the name of Muhammad Ali, and he's associated with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. At the time, he has a close friendship with. And the Nation of Islam at that time is, of course, challenging all of the ideals of liberal integration that many Americans have started to embrace in thinking about the rising tide of the civil rights movement. Of course, these are the same years of the March on Washington movement, of the Birmingham campaign, of Selma in '65.
Yeah, right? I appreciate you bringing that up because it can be easy to disconnect those kind of moments, but they're all happening simultaneously, and it just is important to keep in mind. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, you can't understand Ali without understanding sort of the fact that sort of a certain racial liberalism has come into some of the political mainstream by the early 1960s, and then to sort of the traditional white liberal, they say, who's this guy, right? He's challenging everything that we've been embracing on your behalf, right? Thinking about that sort of larger political narrative of race in the 60s. And of course he becomes a dominant boxer, right? He defends his title 64, 65, 66, 67 against a whole host of challengers, crushes every opponent, really not challenged. But then the next sort of phase in Ali's career, of course, is when he refuses induction into the Vietnam War, claiming a conscientious objector status based on his membership in the Nation of Islam. And so then the political question, or the legal question, becomes, is he objecting on political grounds or on moral grounds? And does he have a conscientious objector status? He's stripped of his heavyweight title. It becomes difficult for him to find bouts. And he's basically at the peak of his career in the late 1960s in exile. Right? And so there's this curious shift. The next stage in Ali's kind of iconography is interesting because he becomes a figure that is kind of, this is right at the same time, and again, thinking about sort of the swirl of politics in the late 60s, you've got the rising Black Power movement, you've got the anti-war movement developing over the course of the late 60s, and consequently you've got on the other side conservatives who are more preaching issues of law and order, of sort of a populist conservatism that is rising. We see it in the candidacy of George Wallace, the third-party candidacy in 1968. And Richard Nixon wins the presidency, signaling the way that many Americans are kind of shifting toward a conservatism in the late 60s. So place Ali in that, and he becomes kind of he becomes a figure for many black Americans as a symbol of the larger wrongs that have been done to black people in America, right? Here's a guy who was stripped of his power, essentially, that the establishment is against us, in other words, becomes a key part of that narrative. He is also going on college speaking tours in the late 60s and talking to people about the anti-war movement, but also talking about the Nation of Islam and his points of view. And he becomes kind of embraced by young Americans because he's one of the most visible spokesmen against the war, which so many young college students have the same political sympathies. So go to this next, again, thinking about these phases of Ali's career, right? When he makes his comeback after he wins a Supreme Court case, he's able to fight in Atlanta in a comeback bout, and then he's able to have these huge celebrated bouts in the 1970s against Joe Frazier, against Ken Norton, against George Foreman. Wins some, loses some, but they're all sort of really big, significant cultural events.
I remember them all.
You think about the Thrilla in Manila against Joe Frazier, his third fight in '75, or the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire in '74 against Foreman. Right? These were massive cultural events at the time, and it's the beginning of the older sports writers had sort of faded out or had come around to Ali. Right? They'd come to see him as a figure of conscience in ways that they weren't willing to see in the 1960s. They admired his resilience. This next stage of his career, he was no longer as physically dominant as he had been in the 1960s. He survived on punching power and on being able to absorb a punch. Right? They admired his courage, which wouldn't have been something that your typical white sports writer would have said about Muhammad Ali in 1965. They are saying in 1975. And then thinking about this last long phase in Ali's career, right? He becomes a man who was seen as among the most controversial figures in American sport in the 1960s, probably the most controversial figure in American sport in the 1960s, becomes seen as this icon of peace, this icon of unity, right? Symbolized especially by the 1996 Olympics when he lights the torch, when he's the surprise guest who lights the torch. He visits the Middle East in various peace endeavors, right? He becomes seen as this figure who people gather, just universally beloved, which is a really interesting shift considering where he started on this narrative, right? So the Muhammad Ali story in a lot of ways can speak to a lot of the ways in which sports can shape larger narratives about race in America, about politics in America. But it's also always worth sort of probing a little bit deeper on that, right? Muhammad Ali, by the 1990s, early 2000s, when he dies, is essentially silent, right? He's because of Parkinson's disease. He can't, he can't really articulate in the way that he could before. So, in a lot of ways, you could argue that people are sort of imposing their own ideas about what Muhammad Ali should be upon him, right? He becomes sort of a stamp through which we can sort of see ourselves, and no matter what our politics are. So,
Sure.
It's always important to be careful about. That's why the history is so important, right? To understand where he came from.
Sure. No, I appreciate that, and the connections between Muhammad Ali and our society. And one aspect of sports that really kind of a two-part question that's often overlooked is the progression and opportunities or lack thereof for women, and in particular women of color, but women in general. Obviously, the historic lack of focus for them, and so that's sort of speak to that a bit historically,
Sure.
And then speak to the importance today, if you will, of how race is intersecting in sports in our society today.
Sure.
So the role of women historically, and then how athletes and sports touch us today.
Right. When you think about black women athletes historically, right, they're obviously facing the double burden, right? The prejudices against women athletes in general, right? There were very few female athletes who were of a high profile in the first half of the 20th century. Someone like Babe Didrikson, a white athlete who was a terrific multi-sport athlete, was seen almost as like a curiosity in the 1930s. There's a famous line by one of the most prominent sports writers of the 30s named Paul Gallico called women muscle moles, like they were basically just like something less than actual women if they were too athletic. If you think about just sort of grassroots participation, women didn't participate in like high school competition typically the same way that boys did. Girls had what were known as play days, where they would race for ribbons, but it wasn't in sort of the same kind of competition. But in the 50s, you start to see the beginnings of that shift. And in some ways, black women are at the forefront of that. There's less stigma attached to black female athletic participation than often there is for white female athletic participation, right? Because black women have historically had to play roles where that weren't just sort of in the terms of conventional femininity, right? They couldn't just be housewives and prim symbols, right? They had to work, and they had to be central to how the family was understood, and all these ways in which black women are sort of central to African American history play out in sports too. And so it might be interesting to pair, just for a different sort of to make the narrative a little more complex. If you take probably the two most prominent black female athletes of the 50s and 60s, Althea Gibson in tennis, Wilma Rudolph in track, right? Althea Gibson is a great tennis champion, of course. She wins Wimbledon. She wins the U.S. Open. She's one of the prominent female tennis players of the 1950s, and faces certain exclusions, right? Like that she has to sort of get support to be allowed to play in the U.S. Open in the early 1950s. She's, tennis is an elite country club sport, and here's this black woman who is invading the sport, so to speak. But Gibson resists being seen as, she hates any comparison, for instance, to being called like the female Jackie Robinson. Right? She doesn't want that kind of political significance attached to her. She's kind of an individualist. She plays this individual sport. She's sort of a solitary figure in her own right. She's sort of quirky in terms of her personality. One of the more recent biographies of Gibson by the Professor Ashley Brown frames her as queer. Not in terms of her sexuality necessarily, but more in terms of her gender presentation. She's almost like an outlier in that sense. And then take Wilma Rudolph. Wilma Rudolph comes out of what was then Tennessee A&I, was now Tennessee State, which had a track dynasty in the 1950s. She participates in the Melbourne Olympics in 1956 when she's just 16 years old. But her real sort of shining moment is in Rome in 1960 at the Olympics. She wins 3 gold medals. She's the first American track athlete to win, female athlete to win three gold medals. She wins the 100-meter dash, the 200-meter dash, and she's part of the 4x100 relay. And Rudolph, part of what makes her a media phenomenon is that she is attractive in a conventionally feminine way. And the press notes this, right? They talk about her beauty. She is very conscious of presenting herself. Like after she races, she will go do her makeup and fix her hair before she goes on the medal stand. She's sort of making an argument, so to speak, an implicit argument that you can be a woman and be an athlete. You can be feminine and you can be an athlete at the same time. And so they get presented, Gibson and Rudolph, in very different terms to the American public. But both come to play this kind of barrier-breaking role in their own way. But both have to struggle with issues of gender. After Rudolph wins the gold medals, she's constantly going back and forth about whether she's going to participate in the '64 Olympics, because she's thinking, I have to be a homemaker, and she's had a kid, and she thinks that she now needs to sort of settle into a regular domestic life, which kind of goes against her instinct and the glories of being an athletic superstar. And so she ends up staying home from Tokyo because she's just had a child, and sort of domesticity makes the decision for her, so to speak. And so there's this balance that black female athletes of the time have to really struggle with.
Sure.
And you could argue that never goes away. If you think about sort of the contemporary great female athletes like Serena Williams, Naomi Osaka, right?
Well, I was going to mention, interesting you pointed to Althea Gibson, and if we were to fast forward to recent times, they're similar conversations. I mean, it would be a wonderful study to look back at some of the language that are written about Gibson and Williams and the like, and to do a compare and contrast, because there's 50-year gap there, if you will, but not so sure that the conversation is all that different.
Right. If you think about the way that Serena Williams has been cast sometimes in the press, both she's been sort of hypersexualized and also desexualized, right? There's been a lot made of her body shape, for instance, and her big butt, right? And sometimes white tennis players have mocked her big butt, and it kind of spoke to sort of these tensions about what does a proper woman look like, right? And the way that African American women have often had to struggle with that. Even Serena Williams, right? Arguably the greatest tennis player in women's tennis history. And so a lot of times those struggles don't go away, right?
Yeah. Well, and if you think about, I'm thinking about some other related struggles. Let's just slap this in the middle of the conversation. Let's go back to 1968. John Carlos and Tommy Smith on the stand at the Olympics with fists raised, and the awe and shock that led to. And then fast forward again, almost 50 years later, thinking about the impact of the conversation around someone like Colin Kaepernick and his ironic kneel, right? Versus standing up and raising your fist, he kneels. But generates a very similar kind of reaction. Like, can you speak to how that matters? How do we make that make sense in our society?
The way that I'd start that conversation is by saying both of those moments, neither of them occurred in a vacuum, right?
Right.
To understand why Tommy Smith and John Carlos are raising their fists at on the medal stand in '68, you have to understand the larger grassroots movement that they've been a part of.
Yes.
Both thinking more largely about the Black Power movement, which has shaped their ideas of who they are, taking pride in your heritage and culture, ideas of self-determination, that black people should live by their standards, not by the larger standards dictated by white society, by understanding racism as a more or less permanent aspect of American society that needs to be combated, a challenge to Martin Luther King's ideals of nonviolence and racial integration as core ideals. But also, more specifically in the sports world, there's something called the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which is led by a sociologist at San Jose State named Harry Edwards. And San Jose State is where Tommy Smith and John Carlos are students, right? They have a track dynasty of their own in the 1960s. And Edwards is calling for a boycott of the Olympics in '68 as a way to sort of call attention to the issues of racial injustice. And there are certain athletes who decide not to participate in the Olympics, including who was then known as Lou Alcindor, but becomes Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the UCLA superstar in basketball. So Smith and Carlos ultimately do decide to participate in the Olympics, right? Being an athlete is kind of central to who they are, and the Olympics is the ultimate goal. But they also use that as a platform. And we can't understand, again, that protest, this cultural, iconic moment, right, without understanding that grassroots protest. Similarly, how can you understand Colin Kaepernick taking a knee without understanding that sort of larger political conversation that's occurring in the United States in the second decade of the 21st century, right? That's spurred by Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Breonna Taylor and so many of these stories of racial injustice, particularly through issues related to policing and law and order, right? And at the same time, understanding that Kaepernick is reacting against the NFL explicitly marketing itself in terms of more conservative politics, that the NFL has made a deal with the Department of Defense dating back to the post-September 11 era to sort of glorify the American military at NFL events with flyovers and patriotic displays and military displays and so on. So Kaepernick's kneel, right, becomes this similarly, it's one moment and it's an image and it's something that we can all quickly gravitate to, right? It's there, it's digestible, it's powerful, but it's built upon something else. Right?
Yes.
Just in the same way that you got to understand Carlos and Smith.
Yeah, I do think that the way you explained that is helpful to our viewers and listeners to understand all of these things are connected and have to have context associated if you really want to get the fullest meaning. And if you think about the sort of ebb and flow, if you will, of where economics fits in, there's an argument that's often made now around there's so much money that is before athletes today, whether you're professional or not, with our recent paying of athletes in some sports, that their willingness and frankly ability to be as in their own way outspoken or attention getting for principled reasons is at risk in a way that it hadn't been for you could say more than a century, going back to someone like Jack Johnson. How do you feel about that sort of argument that the money is so much now that kind of not feeling a sense of collective responsibility isn't there as powerfully as it used to be?
I think it's a slightly more complicated story than that. I think it's important to understand it almost like a double-edged sword. When we're talking about the Bill Russells and the Jim Browns and the Muhammad Alis, the money in sports at that time was there, but it wasn't. But they didn't live lifestyles that were so different from a traditional, say, upper middle class person of the 1960s, right?
Relatively modest.
Yeah, they lived. Sports was lucrative, but it wasn't stratospheric in terms of your wealth, right? And then if you think about some of the transformations that occur, particularly around in the 1980s, think about, say, the NBA, for instance, and the way that it repackages itself and markets itself for mass consumption through Magic Johnson's LA Lakers and Larry Bird's Boston Celtics, and of course Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls, right? That infuses sort of corporate America into sport. The NFL is going through a huge boom, of course, in the 1980s, but with television revenue at the same time. Even a sport like hockey is booming in the 1990s. And on the one hand, to what you were saying, right, it does perhaps have the impact of, in some ways, choking off some political expression. The famous line by Michael Jordan that Republicans buy sneakers too, right? When he was declined to endorse Harvey Gantt in the North Carolina race in 1992 against Jesse Helms, the conservative white senator. And he said it as sort of an offhand joke, but it spoke to a larger issue.
But we still remember
we
it,
still remember,
so
right.
It had impact.
Right. And he didn't speak out of it, for instance, when the Rodney King incident of the early 1990s. That was right around the time that Jordan was winning his first couple titles with the Bulls. And so you can make an argument that the money that his place as a spokesman for corporate America choked off some of that political expression, perhaps. But it was a different political environment in the 1960s, right? When there was a certain pressure to be involved in politics and to be outspoken in ways that didn't exist in the 90s. All that said, that money, that visibility, that creates new opportunities for black athletes too. If you take someone like LeBron James, think about how he's been able to leverage his wealth and his visibility into voter registration campaigns, into popular cultural outlets that really speak to black voices. That's the kind of thing that would have been unimaginable in terms of the scale for Bill Russell or for Jim Brown in the 1960s, right? The money and the visibility has given power.
Sure.
And that's played, I think, directly into politics. If you think about in 2020, when the NBA was in the bubble, this was in the COVID time, and there was the shooting of the man Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in I think August of 2020, if I remember right. And the Milwaukee Bucks team in the playoffs at the time declined to play in their playoff game, right? They withheld their labor. Right?
In the playoffs.
In the playoffs, right? And in this tenuous moment when the bubble experiment in the NBA was underway, that's an extraordinary political moment in terms of the history of sport. That the simplistic thing of all the athletes were political in the '60s, and all the athletes are selfish and conservative now. Yeah. I don't think 2020 disproved that in so many ways. You had so many athletes who were part of Black Lives Matter demonstrations. You think about the WNBA in particular was the most expressly political league. You had women like Renee Montgomery and Maya Moore who even took seasons off to be politically active. The Atlanta Dream were instrumental in helping to elect Raphael Warnock, which tilted the entire balance of the Senate in 2022. And they spoke out against their own team owner, Kelly Loeffler, who was running for the Senate. That's an extraordinary political story in terms of sports.
Well, I'm glad you brought Renee Montgomery's name up in particular. We recently honored her with a MLK Day Sports Legacy Award, and to be in her company and to feel her energy as I still call her an active athlete. And as part owner of the Atlanta Dream now, her appreciation for those who came before her and the knowledge she's gained in having conversations with all types of people who preceded her in their professional pursuits has definitely influenced her. And so someone like her is deserving of modeling, if you will, from the standpoint of understanding their place in this continuum. I appreciate your desimplifying the athletes of radical in the past to they're more restricted now. How it plays out, what's at stake, what are the variables, what the overall climate is, all these things matter. If you were to think about sort of where we are today and where we could go, if you will, and the role of sports in society as its interplay, if you will, in our culture, what do you see on the horizon for sports?
Right. That's a good question. I think it is, like you were just saying, it is always important to set sports into the larger context of whatever era you're discussing. Right? Sports became more political around 2020 because the United States was in a very politically divided moment, very politically contentious moment. Sports is always going to both reflect the larger conversations in American society, but it can also, because of the visibility of the athletes, can help to drive that, right? And a lot of times that is based on the individual decisions and the individual courage of Jackie Robinson or Bill Russell or Renee Montgomery, right? That as historians, we're always dealing with this tension. There's the larger milieu, right? There's the larger culture. There's the larger situation that depends upon mass action and larger circumstances. But at the same time, individuals matter, right? And the decisions that one person makes, when Colin Kaepernick decides to kneel, right, it changed, that whole conversation about race and sport in America. So I think it's important, to your question, to say, going forward, there's going to be new opportunities, I think, because of there doesn't seem to be any sort of slowing down in terms of the money and the visibility that's in sports. Sports remains in our increasingly media fractured society, sports is something that still is the monoculture that still brings people together, right, across different lines and interests and so on. So athletes are going to have those opportunities. If you think about in college sports, as you're suggesting, right, with all the new NIL legislation, that puts money into the hands of young people who are generating revenue, right? But with that will come maybe new pressures, but also new opportunities, right? Mm-hmm. They won't be simply, to be an amateur athlete in a revenue-generating sport is basically to be working for free, right? Like it's a form of labor exploitation, and so the shackles of that have been come off in the last few years, and I think we're still working out in terms of what that looks like. But it's going to speak to new opportunities on the college level, I think, for athletes to leverage that power. And we've seen some examples of this. If you think about it, in the University of Missouri in 2015, when they were protesting their president that they perceived as racist, they were willing to withhold practices and games, right? Like they were willing to do what the Milwaukee Bucks did in 2020. So those trends are there. We'll see. As historians, we know, right? Things don't move in a straight line. We don't see progress on a constant upward scale. It's a roller coaster. But circumstances change, and it's important to understand both how life is different in good, in positive ways going forward, at the same time that we're understanding that the oppressive conditions that we've seen in the past, those have ties to the present and the future.
Sure. Well, what we do know is sports, and I would argue the arts too, are places that, as you described, bring people together in fascinating ways who might not otherwise be. And we also know that there will always be athletes who stand on courage, stand on principle, and stand on what they believe in, and do what they believe to be right at whatever the cost may be. And that's the root of the civil rights movement for everyday people who did that. And some whose names we know, some who we don't. But there's some correlations there that we have to always appreciate. And I thank you for your knowledge and sharing that with us, and your enthusiasm, if you will, thinking about how complicated some of these stories can be and making it attainable for all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Russ. It's a pleasure as always.
To our listeners, we hope that you were enlightened and inspired by our conversation in today's episode with Dr. Aram Goudsouzian. We invite you to take the conversation further. Connect with us on social media at civilrightsmuseum.org and at imagineanamerica.org. Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.